Hi, this is Andre, and thanks for checking out Synthisophy. Synthisophy is integrating the wisdoms of history, based on fact and truth, into our present culture. Let's take a look today at Chapter 7, Neuroreality. Note, Neuroreality was introduced in Chapter 6. Chapter 7 is titled, Your Neuroreality. Remember the 100 billion neurons in your brain that create your perception of reality, your neuroreality? Let's consider human evolution, brain function, cognitive bias, confirmation bias, and argumentative theory as they may relate to neuroreality. As earlier mentioned, we evolved over the past 4 million years from Australopithecus to Homo habilis to Homo erectus to Homo sapiens. Note also during that time, there were a number of other human species, such as Homo rudolfensis, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo neanderthalensis, aka Neanderthal man, Homo naledi, and Homo floresiensis. Note that Homo floresiensis went extinct only about 17,000 years ago. So what was the underlying cause that resulted in Homo sapiens becoming the sole and dominant human species on Earth? One answer could be that cognitive bias, confirmation bias, and argumentative theory were survival mechanisms that were genetically selected for and now appear in us Homo sapiens. How could these traits be the most useful in the survival and dominance of a species over the last 4 million years? Well, in an extraordinarily complex world with an infinite number of stimuli and social circumstances that can surround an individual, perhaps it was beneficial to have a cognitive bias. Rather than analyze an infinite number of stimuli and social circumstances, the brain takes a shortcut and has cognitive biases that allow the individual to make quick decisions and survive in his or her environment. Let's take a closer look at Australopithecus. Here's a model of an Australopithecus based on the skeletal remains found by Donald Johanson and Tom Gray on November 24th, 1974, at the site of Hadar in Ethiopia. They nicknamed her Lucy. So let's consider cognitive bias and fear of the unknown. Let's project a scenario. What if a lone Australopithecus, let's say Lucy, was out gathering fruit and nuts and she heard some rumblings in the brush? What do you think she would do? She would probably run back and seek protection in her larger group of Australopithecus. If the sound was made by a predator like a lion, that cognitive bias resulted in Lucy not being killed by a predator. If the sound was made by a non-predator like an antelope, she didn't have to leave for protection, but when in such a situation, if many individuals did not seek protection in a large group, chances are good a number of them would have been killed by a predator, which would then lessen the chances of that species surviving. So evolution for the species genetically selected this cognitive bias shortcut, which generates the fight or flight response, in this case, flight. Now, let's look at a possible scenario with Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensis. What if there was a group of Homo habilis that looked down from their home base and saw that a group of Homo rudolfensis had set up camp along the river? What would Homo habilis do? Should they walk down to the ridge unarmed and introduce themselves? Should they just ignore the Homo rudolfensis and go about their daily business, hunting and gathering fruits and nuts in the valley? Should they scout the group and then decide to surprise attack? Should Homo habilis send a group of armed individuals down and introduce themselves to the rudolfensis? How would the rudolfensis respond? What would the rudolfensis do? The answer to these questions is not known, but for survival of the Homo habilis, walking up unarmed or ignoring the group altogether could result in their annihilation. Rudolfensis might attack them. So fear of the unknown could be a tribal instinct that is itself a cognitive bias that has been genetically selected and helped the survival of our species and the extinction of others. And in this scenario, Homo habilis may have started projecting their cognitive biases forward and making a decision as to what to do upon entering that unknown Homo rudolfensi tribe. Did they scout the village from afar and see evidence of their cognitive bias, their fear of the unknown? Did they then plan and attack the village? If so, this would explain how Homo habilis survived and rudolfensi went extinct. Discrimination based on race, ethnicity, gender, age, or sexual orientation could also be a product of cognitive bias, as was the case we just described with race in Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensi. Someone today may have a preconceived notion, a prejudice, a cognitive bias about any such group other than their own and apply that prejudice to that individual or group. This kind of discrimination could be the result of cognitive biases that have been genetically selected and neurologically wired over the course of the successful evolution of Homo sapiens, including the next step of looking forward and applying a confirmation bias as we just described in Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensi, which is now present in us, the sole dominant Homo sapien species of today. Our brain's perception of the world, our neuroreality, is influenced by our evolutionary selected and genetically expressed cognitive biases from our evolutionary past. Now, if I may share a very small piece of anecdotal evidence that involves this gentleman right here, Roscoe Orman, playing and has played Gordon Robinson on Sesame Street. I recall an incident watching Sesame Street at the age of 3. Notice I'm a white guy. A black, bald man appeared on Sesame Street reciting the alphabet. That was the first time I had ever seen a black and bald man. I ran screaming and crying to my mother, yelling, "What's that, Mommy? What's that?" Actually, French was the first language I spoke, and at the age of 3, I ran to my mother and said, Mama, qu'est-ce que c'est ça? Qu'est-ce que c'est? Je ne sais pas." My mother calmly explained that that was another person who happened to have no hair and different color skin, and that there are all kinds of people in the world of different color, shapes, sizes, some with hair, some without, that we are all the same people, and he was just like me. After that, I developed a liking for the guy and looked forward to seeing him on Sesame Street. But what was it that caused that initial response? At the age of 3, there's no way I could have developed and learned a bias to a black, bald man that I had never seen before. So that bias must have been that genetically selected cognitive bias of fear of the unknown. So I'd just like to thank Roscoe for giving me that learning experience. And I believe that that's my actual first memory that I can recall as a child. So once the developing human brain had these cognitive biases as a means of survival, the next step would be to apply this bias in a forward manner in a social context. When your cognitive biases are in place, in new situations, you look for confirmation of these biases. Cognitive bias comes first, then the confirmation bias finds information confirming that bias. Do you recall Mercier and Sperber, founders of argumentative theory? Let's review argumentative theory. Argumentative theory is a concept proposed by Mercier and Sperber in their publication, Why Do Humans Reason? Arguments for an Argumentative Theory. Quote, "Reasoning is generally seen as a means to improve knowledge and make better decisions. However, much evidence shows that reasoning often leads to distortions and poor decisions. This suggests that the function of reasoning should be rethought. Argumentative theory claims that the function of reasoning is argumentative. It is to devise and evaluate arguments intended to persuade. Skilled arguers are not after the truth, but after arguments supporting their views. This explains the notorious confirmation bias. Reasoning so motivated can distort evaluations and attitudes and allow erroneous beliefs to persist. Proactively used reasoning also favors decisions that are easy to justify, but not necessarily better. In all these instances, traditionally described as failures or flaws, reasoning does exactly what can be expected of an argumentative device. It looks for arguments that support a given conclusion. Here's another quote from the gentleman who had a conversation with Hugo Mercier. He said, quote, "Reasoning was not designed to pursue the truth. Reasoning was designed by evolution to help us win arguments." That's why Mercier and Sperber call it the argumentative theory of reasoning. So as they put it, the evidence reviewed here shows not only that reasoning falls quite short of reliably delivering rational beliefs and rational decisions, it may even be, in a variety of cases, detrimental to rationality. Reasoning can lead to poor outcomes, not because humans are bad at it, but because they systematically strive for arguments that justify their beliefs or their actions. This explains the confirmation bias. End quote. So here then, argumentative theory is an extension of confirmation bias. So the argumentative theory, as just stated, is an extension and explains the genetically selected human confirmation bias. So a more expanded explanation of human brain development may be that the genetically selected and neurologically wired cognitive biases resulted in the development of confirmation biases that are applied in the thought process described in argumentative theory. I make this statement from the evolutionary perspective. Have you ever been walking through the woods when suddenly nearby a squirrel runs up a tree or a bird suddenly flies away? You jump. That's the instinctive fight or flight response. That is exactly what the Australopithecus did when she ran away for protection from the rumbling in the bushes. And it's exactly what I did when I ran to my mother after having seen a black bald guy for the first time. This is a bias genetically existent in most animals and us as well, so this could very well be a cognitive hardwired bias. So once such cognitive biases were in place in the animal brain, they can be applied down the evolutionary line in more complex situations. Recall, upon entering the Rudolphensi village with their fear of the unknown and cognitive bias, Homo habilis may have relied on confirmation bias, seeing the evidence of their fear of the unknown, which may have been involved in their decision as to what to do, which may very well have been to attack the Homo Rudolphensi. This confirmation bias in Homo habilis could have then led to the argumentative theory, which is an extension of the confirmation bias, which may have developed as Homo erectus migrated out of Africa 2 million years ago and inhabited most of Eurasia in more complex tribes and villages. This then led to Homo sapiens, their exit from Africa 70,000 years ago, and their migration and dominance over the entire world. This then led to the development of agriculture and the advent of civilization some 5,000 years ago, then the Industrial Revolution, and now the Digital Revolution, the Information Age. In this extraordinary, complex society of today, the instinctive cognitive biases, the resulting confirmation bias, applied in the argumentative theory, may all very well be present in the 100 billion neurons in your brain, helping you to generate your perception of reality, your neuroreality.